We're back
Better than ever.
with a brand new episode of
First take.
My name's
Starring.
James.
Yeah. My name's Justin.
and together we're
First
First
take.
Take.
Yeah. That's that was rehearsed.
We
Just for
practiced a
all,
couple
yeah, we
times.
did. 13. We did 13. We did 13 takes. So that was, I think we actually nailed it that time.
It was great. It felt
Mhm.
good and it
Mhm.
flowed
Mhm.
naturally.
And we also talked over each other at just the right time.
Of course.
So yeah, and it kind of threw people out. I think people were thrown. I think they thought that it was happening spontaneously.
This isn't your great aunt's podcast.
No, and it's not a podcast.
We
No,
are
but
in your mind.
yes, and we're here to talk about Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Okay, it's
A gentleman whom I did not know so much about before this
hmm.
deciding to do this podcast. Yet I was pleasantly surprised with the poetry I read from him. Very pleasantly surprised.
Yeah, I think like anyone that speaks English as a first language probably knows who Henry Wadsworth Longfellow is, like knows the name, you know what I mean? But like, I also didn't know as much about him.
Right.
I always knew the name, like Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Yeah, I know Henry Wadsworth Longfellow.
Hmm.
I didn't really know that much about Henry Wadsworth. I didn't know as much as I do today. I know much more, and I don't know that much. Just to clarify.
I mean, when it comes to poetry that should be read aloud, like a poetry that has a
Hmm.
song-like quality, like poetry that's like is sort of what we think of when we think of poetry, you know. Um, in some ways, there's going to be similarities. Going to go ahead and I guess might as well go ahead and drop it. There's going to be similarities between him and Edgar Allan Poe. Like,
Hmm.
even, there's something about Edgar Allan Poe that has influenced poetry till this day. Like the imagery of poetry, like what people think of as poetry, like from the Raven imagery and stuff like that. Like, so Wadsworth is like, I feel like he's just as inspirational. He's just as like sort of almost everywhere. Like once you like read some of his poetry, you'll see like aspects of it everywhere.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. Also, with Edgar Allan Poe, this is something, we were talking off camera about. But, you know, he's touched, American, poetry and literature, in ways I think do go unnoticed. But um, even though he might have been sort of, I don't know, discredited by Edgar Allan Poe during his lifetime,
Mm.
for being more imitative rather than imaginative. I think what Edgar Allan Poe didn't realize at the time is that although Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was very much just doing like what they had already done in Europe, but doing it in English in America, the thing is, no one else really did it after him. So he's kind of like our bridge to
Mm.
that literary tradition that we do not have without him. Um, so I think that's really where his place is he, like you were saying, poetry that needs to be read aloud. Um, he sort of is the American version of like a Homer, of uh, someone who is, a bard. He was really like a national bard, almost, really like our first national bard. Um, Even writing on, current topics for his time, like the Civil War, that was going on. And, maybe even, you could say, people who spoke out against the Vietnam War, they were probably, in some ways, us
Mm.
speaking out against wars, he almost starts that tradition, so he's almost kind of more, sort of prevalent, and more pertinent than maybe we realize.
I think so. Not only that, speaking out as far as the tradition of the American tradition of speaking out against wars, also sort of the American tradition of social activism. He
Hmm.
was sort of writing. He There's a collection of his that is against slavery, or
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
think that's what the name of the collection is, something like that. Songs against slavery or poems against slavery. Maybe I could be butchering the title, but you know, I did kind of read about that in passing, and what's interesting is the first, and a lot of his, what's great about him is a lot of his stuff is in the public domain. The first little bit of his collection against slavery is like he's saying that the same God that compelled John to write on the island of Patmos is like compelling him to write about, sort of in the end of slavery. So even in his social activism, there was an
Hmm.
element of the sort of calls back to the Judeo-Christian world, or
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
Greco-Roman world.
Hmm. Hmm.
So romantic social activism.
Right, right. Definitely was in that romantic, vein. And also, his poetry, as you're kind of alluding to, is also, was political.
Mm,
We kind of have a, uh, history or a tradition of, political poetry in the United States. And he was very much someone who was, writing, about America as it was, sort of happening, which we don't, as far as I'm aware of, don't really have before, on the sort of scale of him being like someone who's writing about like newsworthy current events.
you know, I, and I'm sure there may have been other writers, but none. I don't know if any have really survived to the sort of modern day.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so I think he is sort of definitely can hold the title of like America's Bard,
Hmm.
even
Yeah,
to
for
the
his
point
time.
of, yeah, for his time, and maybe even America's first sort of successful, almost national poet.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and I was listening to his Evangeline, and thinking how he was kind of almost like an American Homer in a way, and he's very much like kind of bringing in, sort of like the kind of the stories of like mythology, and turning them and putting them into like American scenes, in the American context. And I think that's something, while, someone like Edgar Allan Poe, I could see at the time, would be like, this is just, you're just rerunning the same old scripts through, you know, an American lens. Like, how creative is that? How interesting is that? For someone who was well read, and knew of, uh yeah, was just, well read and knew the classics. Someone for like Edgar Allan Poe, he probably did find it sort of boring and not artistic.
Mm.
But as I kind of had said earlier, we I don't know of any, American writers who did the same, or to the extent that Wadsworth Longfellow has done. From
Mm.
what I've read, he really seems to be the first.
I think I agree, and he's the one that survived to the modern day. So he's the one that we read, and the one that has been read and has sort of
Hmm.
survived. And not to be too Darwinian, but he almost kind of gets the award for sort of surviving for so long.
Yeah,
But but
but yeah.
but, but
At the same time, though, he's kind of gone through a period of being, kind of ignored, or being sort of cast over, looked
mm,
over, as like, maybe, as we try and sort of, remake the, you know,
I mean,
uh,
I guess is sort of. I mean, as we look back and we sort of we sort of have much more popularities given to the Edgar Allan Poes, the Emily
Mhm.
Dickinsons,
Mhm. Mhm.
and then like uh post such a figure with such gravitas as a Robert Frost.
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
can see why, Longfellow may have kind of slid to the wayside.
Mhm. Mhm.
But, I Longfellow's definitely one that deserves to have a place in the American canon. And for a while he kind
Mhm.
of in a while in so many ways he almost he what one thing about Longfellow that I kind of admire is almost a bit like Luke, the book of Luke from the Gospels, is his emphasis on women and children. You mentioned Evangeline, which I have
Mhm.
not read, which I intend to read, but I just from what I know of Longfellow, his works feature several heroines.
Mhm.
His works feature several heroines, and his works also feature have an eye towards children. So that kind of reminds me of Luke from the Gospels, and so maybe I could see Edgar Allan Poe finding his work a bit derivative, maybe a bit like, something that has sort of been tread upon before, but I can also see his work having why his work was sort of looked over as the popularity of Edgar Allan Poe's sword, and obviously Emily Dickinson has much more popular now than she ever was in her lifetime, which she would have been one of his
Mhm.
contemporaries while
Right.
she was
Right. Right.
alive. But so
Yeah.
I can
Yeah.
see why Longfellow was passed over, but and I think there's something about him that
Mhm.
does speak to America.
Yeah. I mean, right now, after right now in this moment, I'm thinking that he's almost kind of set the stage for there being an American canon. In a way, he almost sort of like made American, like he almost like legitimizes American poetry, and
Mm,
to a degree by being so, uh, because he's really more of like a scholar first. He's almost like Thomas Aquinas. Like he's like,
mm.
you know, how much of it is it him really like coming up with his own stuff, or just the fact that he, basically made Aristotle understandable to the rest of us, um, and in some ways, it's like how much is it that we're judging Henry Wadsworth Longfellow on him like coming up with new things, or him, being this like interesting soul, or just the fact that he was so well read and well versed in poetry and in languages in Europe, that he was able to bring some of the greatness that he experienced out there home to us, in a way.
I think so because especially something like the epic poem. He wrote an epic poem,
Hmm.
and I haven't read this one as well, but I believe it's called what is it? Hiawatha,
Hiawatha, yeah,
and
that's one, yeah. Mhm.
that
Or
is
Hiawatha, or, yeah,
like an epic poem where the main character is a Native American.
right, right.
So like you said, some traditions of Europe bringing them home to us. Something
Hmm.
like the epic poem, an epic poem where the main character is a Native American,
Yeah.
sounds like the American canon to me.
Mhm. Yeah, and he's also, on one hand, sometimes he's kind of, on that hand, you could say he was like socially aware. You can almost say it's like a woke poem, but then also just as, woke kind of eats its own, he's also criticized for making through his poem Hiawatha, making Native Americans exoticizing them, making them seem exotic, through that as well,
Mm.
even though he was trying to kind of introduce them into, the English, sort of literary canon and thought, So it's kind of, it.
I can see what you're saying, and the illusion you're drawing is apt because
Hmm.
we're talking about a scholar, we're talking about a man of an institution, and woke
Hmm.
is also sort of the institution, even if the corporate structure is an institution, the corporate structure of America, which I believe is sort of where woke came kind of rose to prominence, I guess I'd say, but
Yeah, and in academia.
and in academia, but I think I don't know if academia is as strong in our day and age as it was quite in Longfellow's day, but the bottom line is the institutional illusion is there. So the and I guess there's something about that that does sort of that is sort of self consuming.
Yeah,
Um, but Longfellow, because I guess he his I guess his eye to social justice, his eye to sort of politics. I guess there's a part of that that's sort of inextricable from America and American rhetoric overall. Even when
yeah,
things like slavery being known as the original sin, and the interactions with the Native Americans kind of get being retro coined, genocide being a term that was sort of invented much late, or much later, or like a holocaust or genocide, sort of retroactively being applied to the Native Americans. I guess the sort of eye for social justice and these sort of institutional inclinations are inextricable from America itself in some ways, or at least its rhetoric.
yeah. It's it's interesting because one thing I think kind of going back to academia, he did go to he went to college. He went to I think it's pronounced Bowdoin or Bowdoin College, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then he was a professor there, and to be take that professorship, he had, part of it was him going and traveling through Europe for a time. And I think that and then he was a professor at Harvard, and he went to Europe, kind of several times. But he went to he was in academia, he was an academic, but it was different back then because he went to college when he was like 14 or 15, and we think of all these guys that in the past that have gone to Harvard. It's kind of a different thing. College wasn't post-secondary, it wasn't like something you did after high school. They didn't have kind of the same systems. Academic, it's similar but kind of different, the path that one would sort of take. He like essentially became a professor when he was like 20 or 21 years old.
Right.
um and he was teaching modern languages is what they called it, which was like basically learning French and German and Spanish and Italian.
He basically was one of the first modern language professors are teaching the idea of, because before people would just all everybody would just learn Latin or
Hmm.
Greek, and that was sort of the
Hmm.
language of people that knew anything.
Right, right,
If you
yeah,
knew
yeah,
anything, but
yeah, if
no
you were
one was
educated, yeah, you like knew Latin, and Greek, yeah.
right. So he kind of helped develop even our idea of like learning modern languages. So
Right.
he's almost like America's Tolkien in that way.
Yeah, and even more, I kind of thought of that on the fly earlier, but like even more so with Thomas Aquinas, being someone who's, a great, sort of synthesizer.
He's America's Thomas Aquinas. I can see that as well. Um, and I
Yeah.
mean,
I mean, I think you want to go ahead and just get into the poems.
we could get into we could go ahead and get into the poems. I mean, he's almost like there's almost like several figures throughout history that you could compare him to.
Mm, mm-hmm,
He's he's almost like a seminal figure, while at the same time he's like a man's man in some ways,
mm.
just because he's not afraid to be with his wife and be with his children.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
in some ways that is like a I that is like a man, what I consider to be like almost like a man's man,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
like
Certainly humanizes him.
mhm. But yeah, so um I could go first.
Yeah, yeah. I think I went first last time, so that is fitting.
The poem that I chose to do is from a collection of poems by Longfellow known as Ultima Thule. That's sort of like an island, like sort of like a faraway island, I guess, a very far away sort of place. But the poem I chose to do is Jagurtha, And Jugurtha is basically like a is an African king that was sort of conquered by a Roman general, and man, that his name the general's name escapes me now, but he was part of a Jugurtha was part of a this conqueror's triumph, this Roman conqueror's triumph, and the triumph is basically like when you return to Rome, you kind of parade around all the people you conquered, and Jugurtha was a king of in Africa that was sort of conquered by the Romans and paraded through a triumph and then thrown in a dungeon. So not a very good fate for Jugurtha, but his sort of a you know Longfellow was able to find inspiration in that story and write this poem. So I will be reading this poem and giving my analysis on it afterwards. So without too much further ado, I will read Jugurtha by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Jugurtha. How cold are thy baths, Apollo? Cried the African monarch, the splendid, as down to his death in the hollow, dark dungeons of Rome he descended, uncrowned, unthroned, unattended. How cold are thy baths, Apollo? How cold are thy baths, Apollo? Cried the poet, unknown, unbefriended, as the vision that lured him to follow, with the mist and the darkness blended, and the dream of his life was ended. How cold are thy baths, Apollo? Now, as we talked about before, Longfellow was a learned man, a man of academia. The audience he was writing for were also people who would have sort of been familiar with sort of ideas and mythology from the Greco-Roman world. There's a famous play in the Greco-Roman world where, or even there's a myth where like Hercules sort of rests by taking a bath, like a warm bath. And so there's this idea that it's a Greco-Roman idea of like a warm bath may make one soft, but if Hercules was able to take a warm bath, then they can't be too bad. Like your bath can't, like a warm bath can't be too bad if the great Hercules was able to take one, you know? So the idea of like the cold bath is like, it's almost like sort of like a realization, like, cold water being sort of like thrown in your face. So Jugurtha, he's suffering. How cold are thy baths, Apollo? He used to be this high, splendid individual, but now he's going down to the dark dungeons of Rome. He's been sort of stripped of his crown and stripped of his, his robes and sort of his kingliness. And him being foreign, he may have heard of the baths of Rome, but he's finding them cold. Obviously, he has no largesse in Rome at all. He's being thrown down into the dungeon. But it's interesting because these are known as the baths of Apollo. Apollo being sort of the god of the sun, music, uh, even archery and poetry itself. So just as the ancient king finds the dark dungeons of Rome to be cold and a stark realization of life. In the second stanza, we have a poet who this seems to be the fear of a lot of poets from the 18th and 19th, or the 19th and 20th centuries. Pardon me. They always talk about ending up in the gutter, being like down, being like ended up being nothing, and it is a fear of all artists. What if my artistry doesn't work? What if I end up defeated and destroyed? How cold would Apollo's baths be? Apollo, you're the god of music, the god of poetry. Have I not served you? Have I not been there for you? Have I not made my sacrifices to you, Apollo? How cold are thy baths, Apollo, cried the poet, unknown, unbefriended, as the vision that lured him to follow, with the mist and the darkness blended. My vision that I followed has now become dark and is blended, and the dream of my life has ended. I'm like that haughty King Jugurtha, stripped and thrown in the dungeon. How cold are thy vast Apollo after I followed you all this time. So this
Yeah.
is the cry. This is the cry of many artists, that
Hmm.
we don't end up like Jugurtha, stripped of our lofty ideals and thrown in the dungeon. And
Hmm.
so, I thought this poem was a good one, and I thought it was a good one to do, and I thought a lot of artists and poets could relate.
Yeah.
How cold are thy baths, Apollo?
Yep.
You know,
Yeah. This one's it's a splash of cold water on the face, you know.
right,
It's when you have those, realizations, sometimes where you're like, I'm an idiot, you know?
right,
You know, like where
right.
you just like you remember something and you're like, I'm a complete idiot and
Mm,
I deserve, I mean, just endless humiliation.
mm,
For that thing I did, 6 years ago, 10 years ago, whatever it was, I don't know, that's what I think of when, how cold are thy baths, Apollo? This
mm,
just this fresh water where you're like, I'm a complete fool. It's humbling.
right.
And, I think that's where you have like this with this, the African monarch, he almost maybe he too, has this splash of fresh water, this cold realization, it's a blessing, and it feels like, all of a sudden you are down in the dungeon. You're a monarch, but you're in the dungeon. It's like it's almost the opposite, like you've gone down into the underworld almost, a cold bath, and you
Mm,
come back out. It's almost like a baptism, and the same with the poet, like for the monarch, it looked like, for him, it felt like being in a dark dungeon. For the poet, it felt like being unknown and unbefriended, having not a sympathetic ear to hear your poetry. That's what
right.
it feels like, for him to feel like a fool, like, oh, I wrote this and I bared my soul and no one related to it and everyone thought it was stupid and now I am I look like a fool and I'm alone in my
Right.
art.
And it's very interesting that you say that splash in the face, that moment of realization, because
Hmm.
the legend has it, Jugurtha actually screamed, he actually shouted, "How cold are thy baths, Hercules," when they ripped his earrings from his ears.
Mm,
When his earrings were ripped, they ripped his clothes off, ripped his earrings from his ears, and then before he's thrown in the dungeon, how cold are thy baths, Hercules? The poet Longfellow, obviously he expands it from just because Jugurtha is making an allusion to Hercules, taking warm baths, yet Jugurtha finds the baths of Rome to be cold. And that and that's what the poet kind of means by how cold are thy baths, Apollo. This is the bath of Rome itself, you know as
yeah,
opposed to the idea of Hercules taking a warm bath, where Jugurtha himself takes a cold bath. So
yeah. Hmm.
Jugurtha makes one allusion in the mythology, but in the poetic space, the baths are of Apollo, because these are all the baths of Rome. Because in some ways, Jugurtha and the poet, we're talking about everyone who sort of dies in the gutter, dies in the dungeon. That's why these are the baths of Apollo, the baths of the god of sun. Some would even almost say the god of like Roman civilization. Apollo is sort of the god of Roman civilization, but that breaks down into, the sun, sunshine, poetry, music, and archery as well.
Yeah. I feel like with that though, when he's, talking to Hercules, it's almost like, how cold, how unfeeling, how tough are
Mm,
you? Like you must take cold baths. You must
mm,
not, you must not have any feeling, huh? You know,
Mm.
how
I can
cold
see
hearted
that.
are you? You know, you
I can see
you
that.
must nothing bothers you, huh? You know, you don't care
Mm.
one bit. You know,
Right, right.
how how much this pains me. This doesn't bother you a bit, huh?
Almost saying how cold Rome
Mm,
really is.
mhm,
And
mhm.
it's also interesting, people talk the evil of Rome is something that has been commented on endlessly. And some people would say out of that evil we get Christian the Christian sort of, like, you almost need a backdrop of evil to really have the Christian story really bloom. So
I wonder too, though, if it's not talking about like even like Apollo um as Muse, like, how cold are your baths, Apollo? Like, here I am, the poet,
right.
pained, trying to be, trying to tap into you, trying to express, poetry, and you don't care one bit, how
It's
how I
because
feel or,
it's because Rome is also has this lofty Rome also holds this lofty place, in sort of Western society. Rome holds this lofty, elevated place. Yet obviously Jugurtha, like you said, finds it cold and unfeeling. Just as the poet has upheld poetry in this high, lofty place. Yet the poet, unknown, unbefriended, finds the bath of poetry to be cold and unfeeling.
it's almost like, with the African monarch, no matter how much he, studies Rome or tries to emulate Rome, he'll never be Rome, and therefore he's uncrowned, unthroned, unattended, because he'll never have the splendors of Rome.
Or maybe at one time he was splendid, and maybe he thought that that splendidness would carry through his conquering, but I think maybe not, because he is now uncrowned, unthroned, and unattended.
I'm thinking because the further he goes into Rome, the further away he goes from being a king, almost in a way, because he descends into the, you know, he goes down into to his death in the hollow, dark dungeons of Rome. He
But the
descended. It's like he's going into Rome, and as he's going further away from his kingship.
but the thing is, part of the horror is his, before he's thrown in that dungeon, is his public, being on public display in the triumph as being conquered. Look at this African king that was so high, he is now conquered. It is there is a bit of a Jesus motif in there. Look at, he is paraded through the street sort of defeated. But the thing is, he is a part of a triumph at the same time, so it's like there is almost like a dark beauty in being a part of a triumph. And then, it's almost like one last hurrah. Just as the sadness of the poet is almost like a poetic hurrah. It's almost like a poetic ecstasy of sadness. We have that
Being alone.
right. We have that ecstasy in the second stanza, just as there's almost like an ecstasy in the first stanza. It's a horrible ecstasy, but it's because the only reason he's a part of this one last triumph is because he was once a king, which is the only reason why the poet is able to lament and cry out in such a way, is because they once had high, lofty, poetic ideals. So in some ways, we have the subversion of the splendor of Rome. Rome, in a lot of romantic poetry, Rome is sort of Rome. The Greco-Roman world is sort of viewed as like being. Sometimes it's viewed as being splendid. Other times it's a place where heroics can
Hmm.
happen, like a place where heroics are still allowed to happen.
Hmm.
But and that is almost like a place of the imagination where the imagination can sort of be exalted. But
Hmm.
in this poem, we have Rome and the imagination both being portrayed as something that has sort of been held up, but proves to be like, like the once the person participates in it, they find it to be sort of cold and indifferent.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm kind of seeing it almost like like a lover, a spurned lover, someone who imagines a great love, gets into a relationship. I don't know, for some reason, like it's not exactly what they wanted or thought it was going to be. They leave it, because they still have this great idea of love they've been lured to, you know, and then they look back and realize that maybe they had it all along,
Mm-hmm.
with this person, and but, kind of their imaginations of what love should be, kind of keeps them from enjoying the moment, that uh, in like in the hardship with the person they're with.
I can see that too. Or like I can, the especially the idea of it being one thing, but
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
experience of it being another thing.
Yeah, it's like the splendor of Rome can spoil a crown, and the for the poet, the idea of like, kind of maybe accessing, communicating these deepest, darkest, like personal truths, actually in turn makes you alone.
Because with this poet, you know, the vision that lured him to follow
Hmm.
with the mist and the darkness blended. This
Hmm.
vision that was so clear, this
Hmm.
vision
Hmm.
that he thought was step by step
Yeah, might have been
has now,
even sunshine.
right. And that's the thing, like Apollo is also the god of the sun. So the sunshine,
Could be
the splendor of Apollo can blind. you
this
know
this the poet could be Poe. The poet could be, Poe with mixed with maybe addiction. And that was, the poet, with the great artist, the creative thinker who, maybe through the mixing of, I don't know, drugs or whatever,
mm,
alcohol, that's the darkness with the vision blended,
damn,
and the dream of his life was ended. He
damn.
got too caught up in experiencing it, and
It's
and it's over
crazy.
before he knew it.
It's crazy that you bring that up, and that's why I do this podcast with you. You brought up addiction. I wasn't even gonna go there. I swear to God, I wasn't even gonna go there. I was just gonna see if it comes up because
Yeah.
you brought up because Apollo doesn't like when this
You
is
just
brought
wanted to
up.
test me. You just wanted to see
I
if I
just wanted
would
to see
if
what
I
would
was gonna
happen.
take it there. Okay, sure.
Apollo doesn't like when this is brought up because you brought up Apollo's shadow, if you will,
Hmm.
Dionysus. Now you
Hmm.
brought
Yeah, that's what I
because
was thinking too with Diamond. Yep,
now
right.
you brought up
Because
Dionysus
him
because
being taken, thinking of Apollo being drugged through the streets of Rome, that's where he becomes Dionysus, and he's just the god of wine, and it's just debauchery.
because in a way because Dionysus is also like he kind of mimics Apollo and also being like a god of like music and poetry
Hmm.
and like
Hmm.
but
Inspiration.
it's more like the ecstasy of it or the sort of the in almost like the heat of the moment of it,
Hmm. Hmm.
as opposed to the well metered Apollo, the well marshaled Apollo, you know what I mean? Because Apollo's kind of, the archer as well.
Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
Dionysus
Hmm.
is not the well metered, because there's an
Hmm.
aspect of poetry in music that is the archer.
Hmm.
There's an aspect of poetry and music that is the drunkard.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
that's where we
Yeah,
have
which we did with Levi.
right. We did. That's why we have Apollo and Dionysus
And you
that
know who
rule
we should
between the
do?
two.
We
Who?
should do Charles Bukowski.
Right, right.
It's a
But
shame that we haven't.
but he has so many short stories.
I
I
mean,
does he have
yeah.
much poet?
What do you mean? Yeah, of course, of
Yeah, yeah,
course.
yeah. But like I thought,
I
I
mean,
just
he's
feel like
also a prose writer. I know some.
and a lot of his poetry is just kind of long. That's what I'm just thinking, But
Mm.
just
No, we
think
should do Bukowski. We
right,
should
right,
do
right, right. We
Bukowski.
should, but we also
Yeah,
did
it's not all
we.
Dinosauria. That's a longer one.
It is,
Yeah.
but we did Kerouac, and he has
Right.
some long ones too.
Exactly.
But he's
Exactly.
also has that the
The blues.
Dionysian energy,
Yeah, he does. He
and
does.
the blues has
Yeah.
Dionysian energy as well.
Yeah.
But
He
so yeah,
does.
that's I wasn't even gonna bring up the intoxication aspect because
Hmm.
you don't really have to for this poem,
Hmm.
because this
Hmm.
poem is focused on
Yeah. Yeah.
Rome's sort of splendor and like well
Hmm.
measuredness,
Yeah.
but there's also the side of Rome that is intoxicant and chaotic. So
Who is
that's
it? Yeah. Who is it that does the poem? Um, Poor Richard Cory, where
Richard
he
Court.
he
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 wrote a
drank and drank and drank
right.
about it. He thought
Mm,
about it.
I don't
Oh
know. I
man,
could.
who did? It's not A.E. Houseman. Edwin Arlington Robinson. That's who does it. Edwin Arlington Robinson
Oh, okay,
or
yeah,
Richard Cory.
okay.
And he is that second stanza. Poor
Mm-hmm.
Richard Cory is.
Oh,
Where
always reading about the past,
always,
right?
yeah, dreaming. If only he had been a oh, what's that famous Italian family from in Florence
Oh,
started banking.
the
Um,
Medici.
but yeah, if only he had been a Medici, he would have sinned endlessly.
Mm,
Um, you know, he should have been a knight in shining armor.
mm. So yeah, hey man, great. I mean, I saw Dionysus in the with the mist and darkness
Hmm.
blended,
Hmm.
because like it's
Yeah.
like, oh, it was so clear when we were with Apollo. It was so
Hmm.
clear, like we had such a clear idea, but then like the intoxicant aspect, and I wasn't gonna even bring that up, but you brought up Poe addiction, and
Yes.
I
Yeah.
Poe definitely
Right. We
is
even
when
we think of him with what's the spirit that's comes from
absinthe, right?
yep.
Absinthe, yeah. That's
Right.
very romantic. That's the dark side of the romantic era, the
Yeah.
very
This
19th century,
intoxicant.
right? Opiate
Yeah,
baths, opiate
right,
dens,
exactly.
and
Yep, yep, yeah. Yeah,
like so.
visions, drug induced visions, that's Edgar Allan Poe.
Longfellow, the scholar, very
Hmm.
much Apollo.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
Then, but then also, we have the Poe with the Dionysian side, but also a lot of poets from this time period, maybe because trying to may have a career in poetry was so new and wasn't a guaranteed thing, they all talk about, the horrors of dying alone and being unknown, and like
Hmm. Hmm.
this is also a common theme throughout the time. So
Yeah.
I like
Yeah.
this poem a lot, and that's
Hmm.
since we hit on so many things, that's why I decided to do it, because it brought up
Yep.
so many things.
Yep.
So
Or
I
yeah,
like to
hey,
go
it's a
ahead
good
and
one. Good,
yeah, I'd
good,
like to
good pull.
read it again, take another
Go
turn
ahead.
at it, go ahead and read it again, and since it's not that long, and then we will move on. But
Yes.
once more, Jagurtha by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow.
For the last time.
The second time this podcast. Here we go. How cold are thy baths, Apollo? Cried the African monarch, the splendid, as down to his death in the hollow, dark dungeons of Rome he descended, uncrowned, unthroned, unattended. How cold are thy baths, Apollo? How cold are thy baths, Apollo? Cried the poet, unknown, unbefriended, as the vision that lured him to follow with the mist and the darkness blended, and the dream of his life was ended. How cold are thy baths, Apollo? So, you know, this type of stuff is on the horizon for all poets and artists. I hope it does not come to pass. But
Good
it's
luck.
out there. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it is
Yeah.
out there.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And
Um,
now,
yeah. Cool. Well, hey,
okay.
My poem's a little bit longer. That was a good one, but mine's a little bit longer. Written from a little bit earlier. Yours was, that Ultima Thule was supposed to be, kind of the end of his poetry. So that was kind of
Right.
that was a
Which
seasoned veteran poet, and it was a seasoned veteran poem. Um,
and that also why it might be a little dark, a little pessimistic, as he was thinking
Perhaps
of the end of his life,
it came from an experienced voice, I feel like.
for sure.
Um, but for me, I am doing a Psalm of Life, which came a little bit earlier, and this one um, is well known. I'm going to go ahead and read it here, but it's one of his most well known poems, and we're going to see kind of the difference here between an older hymn, and kind of more, kind of what became, to be seen as cliche later on. So, a Psalm of Life, and it has a little epitaph here, or epigraph. What the heart of the young man said to the psalmist. Tell me not in mournful numbers, life is but an empty dream, for the soul is dead that slumbers, and things are not what they seem. Life is real, life is earnest, and the grave is not its goal. Dust thou art, to dust returnest, was not spoken of the soul. Not enjoyment and not sorrow is our destined end or way, but to act, that each tomorrow find us farther than today. Art is long, and time is fleeting, and our hearts, though stout and brave, still, like muffled drums, are beating funeral marches to the grave. In the world's broad field of battle, in the bivouac of life, be not like dumb, driven cattle, be a hero in the strife. Trust no future, however pleasant, let the dead past bury its dead. Act, act in the living present, heart within, and God o'erhead. Lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime, and, departing, leave behind us footprints on the sands of time. Footprints that perhaps another, sailing o'er life's solemn main, a forlorn and shipwrecked brother, seeing, shall take heart again. Let us, then, be up and doing, with a heart for any fate, still achieving, still pursuing, learn to labor and to wait. So that one, I had a couple missteps there, but I hope that you all were able to kind of follow along and see that that has much more of a kind of, almost it's like a marching band music, this it's like kind of this more sort of triumphant, very much more optimistic kind of, almost, like this is like a little inspirational speech, this is the kind of thing that, it's easy to see why people would, with this kind of being his, you can see one, why this is so popular, two, why it would cause later, you know, people who were more literary inclined to sort of roll their eyes at Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, you know. And so, but, kind of, this is one I don't know. I don't have too much to say about it because it doesn't feel like one that I can like go in and like dissect and like figure out what he means. It's kind of straightforward,
I mean,
Um,
it reminds me a bit of Invictus.
mhm,
It's kind of
mhm,
like that. I think Invictus, people might not say that. I mean, I don't think people will say Invictus is quite. People might say this one's a bit cheesy,
mhm,
but I enjoy this one.
mhm,
I like his insistence. Life is real, life is earnest, and the grave is not its goal.
mhm,
Dust
mhm.
thou art, to dust return, as was not spoken of the soul. Obviously there is an element. Some could say that's a bit nihilistic to say ashes to ashes, dust to dust. But the
Yeah.
Bible. the Bible and the Judeo-Christian tradition speaks to something else intrinsic that sort of survives the body, something that sort of survives death,
Yeah,
and
that's a good.
Longfellow's also speaking to that.
Yeah, no, I mean that's a good point, and I mean he's making that distinction. It is kind of nice to hear to see that he's saying, hey, the soul, the soul is not what dies, you know.
Mm-hmm.
The body goes back to dust, and the body is dust. He's not saying that that's wrong, but he's
Right,
just saying that it doesn't apply necessarily,
right.
and
That's not quite
maybe
what we're talking about now.
right. Yeah, yeah. And that is kind of relieving today's day and age when you think of, because coming out of postmodernism, we almost need to hear this.
Mm-hmm.
That first, with those, you know, tell me not in mournful numbers, life is but an empty dream. I mean, in some ways, he could be talking to people that are like, hey, look, like, you can't just tell me that this is all that it is. You're just going to die and you're going to,
Right.
close your eyes and it's all going to be over. I mean, come on, this isn't just some fanciful vision going on before our eyes that's going to end,
Mm-hmm.
uh, you know, life is real, life is earnest, he's like
Right.
shaking him, to,
He's trying to awake people
yeah,
to kind of like a
right.
spiritual reality.
Yeah,
I mean, there
yeah.
are those who spend time, and this was around the time of, in the Romantic era, there was a lot of people in academia who claimed to have be getting more and more of a grasp on the world. So
Mhm,
a lot
mhm,
of the romantics felt the need to inject a bit of whimsy and
mhm.
mystery and wonder back into the
Yeah,
world. So
yep.
for the soul is dead that slumbers. And things are not what they seem to me. That's almost said to, like, maybe somebody, and I'm looking through a microscope, an early microscope in the 1800s, are doing some of the first experiments and
Mhm, mhm.
I don't know, rocketry or things like
Right.
that.
Yeah. Well, I
Um,
like.
oh,
Yeah, I was gonna say, and that in that second stanza, "And the grave is not its goal," I kind of like
mhm,
that too, where it's like, hey, look, we're not just here to die, we're not
right,
just destined to death. Like we're here to do something else. He's trying to, like you said, waking people up. He's trying to, like, in kind of in I don't want to say invect, no, but he's trying to, like, inject, yeah, inject some vigor, into the kind of the soul of the reader a little bit. Hey, it's not like we're all just gonna die and it's gonna be over and nothing matters. Come on, we
mhm,
you know this means something. It's not just about enjoyment and not sorrow. Is our
mhm,
destined end or way. 'Cause I like that because it's not happiness that's our destiny. It's not happiness that's the end goal. We kinda need to hear that today, because we want,
yeah,
and happiness is supposed to be our end goal. It's supposed to end happily ever after. We're supposed to, end on the good side of things. It's not enjoyment and not sorrow is our destined way, but to act that each tomorrow find us further than today. And to that I say, maybe that's kind of like, obviously we know we don't get any further,
mhm,
you know, physically or literally, but
right,
maybe, he's pushing us to try and he is pushing us towards some kind of idea of progress here. This is progressive,
right.
in a sense.
We are sort of on a, like, if we are like sort of on a journey, and Longfellow is a person that does believe that we can improve the world.
Hmm.
Nothing wrong with that belief,
Hmm.
but that is his belief. He believes we
Right.
can improve the world, especially
Hmm.
even the next stanza, art is long and time is fleeting.
Hmm. Hmm.
Like, I think you and I have sort of spoken about this, about how, like, poetry is a bit of a old man's game in some
Hmm.
ways,
Hmm.
and how, like, some of the old blues guys, they play guitar like, played guitar like almost like no
40
other.
years before they,
Right, right.
before even, they even got recorded.
And they'd have such unique styles and just
Right.
crazy
Yeah.
lines, and
Because they just learned the guitar.
right, just, yeah, just, and then they, so I feel like there's a little bit of that sentiment, and even though our hearts are sort of like funeral marches to the grave, there's something beyond the body.
Yeah, and that kind of moving, it's like he's really saying that we can improve the world, but we can do it through art. Art is
Mm,
long and time is fleeting. Art is what is sort of immortal that we can kind of,
mm,
we can,
right.
you know, you
Hang
have
our
the
hats
day,
on, so to
right?
speak.
Yeah, yeah. This is the thing through which we can kind of improve ourselves, is like through art.
Mm,
Um, and our hearts, though stout and brave, still like muffled drums are beating funeral marches to the grave. Even to our death, our heart is thumping. It's playing its own music, and that is like what we are, at the end of the day, even our bodies, you know,
but there
and
is
that.
something about art that allows us to sort of transcend that.
And you could even get to that, you could get to like some kind of new age spiritual metaphysical place and say, hey, everything is vibrations. Our own physical bodies give off vibrations. Even our own bodies, auras, spirits on this earth give off vibrations. And through art, we can give off vibrations that will hopefully impact others beyond us.
Mm,
And you know, I think Henry Wadsworth Longfellow also had an eye to sort of, if not improving the minds of the people per se, but, kind of imparting something on the people
right.
of his time, culture, country, what have you. Um, he's telling us not to be like dumb driven cattle. He's saying that the world's a broad field of battle. Uh, in this, bivouac, of
Biv-
life. This, how do
like
you, what,
I think it's bivouac, and I
bivouac? Yeah.
I think that's a like it's interesting, talk about like this being like American poetry.
hmm
I
hmm
think that's like a type of Native American structure.
mm
Um,
Well, I think,
uh,
that also talks about the heart too.
mm,
Kind of like, like kind of give it, almost like a give and take. Even speaking to this sort of like bump, this sort of two two sides of life.
it's interesting that he mentions the heart. I think we do sort of have I ams here.
Right, yeah, exactly. Even IAMs,
Like
that's why we even talk about like, 4/4, with music, it's like two
in the
heartbeats,
world's broad field of battle, in
hmm
the bivouac of life.
Be
Sort of
not like duck driven cattle, be
be
a
a
hero
hero
in the
in the
strife.
strife.
Yeah, he's saying be an individual. This is even going back to America. In China, they have something where they talk about, the nail that sticks above, gets knocked down. He's saying be that nail. He's saying be a hero in the strife. Stand out. Be
Right.
firm. You know. Uh, go against the grain. Go against the uh with a river, the current. Go against the current. Um,
Right.
push forward. Um, Trust no future, however pleasant. Let the dead past bury its dead. I mean, that's something Jesus tells us. Let the dead bury
Exactly.
the dead. And trusting no future, however pleasant. That's like saying like don't believe in any heaven.
Hmm.
And Jesus even tells us heaven is not somewhere, in
Right.
in the sky. I'm paraphrasing here, but it's
The kingdom
right
of heaven
here.
is nigh.
Yeah, yeah. So, trust no future, however pleasant, let the dead past bury its dead. Act in the living present, heart within and God o'erhead. Again, we're talking about the heart.
Right.
Again, he's talking about God o'erhead. I mean, not again, but he's talking about being in the present moment.
Tr-
He's like, you know,
Transcendence in the present
Yes,
moment.
we've talked about this too,
Yeah.
transcending in the present moment, you know, and why we connect with art and literature from the past is because that person was in the living present, in the present moment, and that's the only thing that exists. And so
Right.
when we experience that from an artist, in the past, that's when we say like, oh, this guy was ahead of his time.
And that's picked up in the next, and that's picked up in
Yeah.
the very next stanza picks that up.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. With, lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime. It's like, looking on, he's encouraging us to look at, even though he's Protestant, look at saints, the lives of saints, and
Hmm.
departing leave behind us footprints on the sands of time. Um, what's funny is this made me think of, I'm not, I like sports, and Deion Sanders right now is being talked about becoming potentially the next head coach of the Dallas Cowboys. And I
Mm.
heard Michael Irvin, former teammate of his at Dallas Cowboys, Hall of Fame wide receiver, talking about, Deion Sanders and saying everywhere he's been, he's left footprints in the sand. You know, these are things we still talk. It's just kind of funny.
Right,
We're talking about this today. What does that
right,
mean? Leaving footprints in the sands of time. It's just leaving a mark. He's,
right.
in some ways, it's kind of funny. It's kind of almost, I
There's
don't know.
all
So,
and there's a poem. There's a poem about footprints in Jesus that's almost been written into the Christian canon. I
right,
wonder.
yeah,
I wonder if that has
yeah, yeah, yep.
sort of similar illusions.
I think that's why, Michael Irvin, knowing him and Deion Sanders are, religious people. I think that's
Hmm.
why he's, using that illusion. But it's just kind of funny to me. But, footprints that perhaps another sailing o'er life's solemn main, a forlorn and shipwrecked brother seeing shall take heart again. You know, this is kind of, I think around the same time Robinson Crusoe was in the
Mm.
1800s.
Yeah.
Um, it'd be
Well,
interesting to see what the time was between these, but I'm thinking a shipwrecked brother,
mm.
uh, and even just the idea of, being shipwrecked and, um, being, kind of, because even Robinson Crusoe, he finds the Bible, and that's like how he, you know, kind of makes it through, you know,
Right.
through his hardship that he's going through. During his time when he feels most alone, you know, he finds the Bible and it leads him out. Um, he takes heart again. Let us then be up and doing with that heart for any fate, still achieving, still pursuing, learn to labor and to wait, that kind of being with a heart for any fate, I think of like, just being like up for anything, just being like, it's in God's hands.
Open.
I'm just gonna give it my absolute best effort, let the cards fall where they may, and and so be it,
Right.
and this is like, in essence, I mean that's I don't know if there's a better attitude to have just about life or anything.
It's kind of the American way.
Yeah, yeah.
Whatever happens, happens.
Right. Yeah. Hey, it's in God's hands. Jesus, take the wheel.
I like the line "sailing o'er life's solemn main." Kind of
Mm,
reminds me of
mm,
maybe Mississippi John Hurt. You gonna walk
mm,
that lonesome valley. Um,
mm,
you know, you gonna walk that lonesome valley, and this is life's solemn main. This is the main. I believe a main is a term for like a shipping lane. This is the main lane. Like you're
mm-hmm,
gonna
mm-hmm,
hit this lane.
mm-hmm,
We're
mm-hmm.
sailing over life's solemn main.
Right. Yeah. These are the courses of events that one goes through,
Right.
travailing this, and through a lot of, spiritual and, religious work, you'll see, the body, the soul, referred to as a ship, you know?
Hmm.
And so, and here we have it as well.
Right. Learn to
So,
labor and to wait. Hey, that's craft work right there.
right, yeah, exactly. You just wait, and this is the even craft work. This is a message for, artists as well. Hey, inspirational come.
Right.
Just learn to write, learn to paint, learn to, play the guitar. Just, learn to play the guitar. It'll hit you,
Switch it up.
Hmm.
Do something different. Don't be afraid to experiment. Change
Yeah,
up. Hey,
yeah.
I try to, you got to constantly experiment, try something different,
I remember listening to a preacher, a pastor talk. He said, so when you lose the passion, you have to get back to the practice because it was the practice that got you to the passion. So if you feel like you're not feeling the passion for it, get back into the practice and the passion will come. And that's what I think of with this. Hey, life, sometimes you lose I've lost it, lose the zeal for life, you know.
Right.
I've had it and I've lost it. The times when I've had it, you just got to get back to, I don't know what it is, whatever it is for
Small
you.
mechanical steps.
Yep, yep, yep. And
That's what
just
practice is, really.
mm-hmm. Learn to labor and to wait. Just keep at it because you never know.
Right.
And when it comes around, it's good.
It is. It's
We
good
all
when it
know
comes
that. We
around.
all know. We don't.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yep.
But so yeah,
But
man. I mean,
yeah.
these are kind of the two poems are kind of serve two messages of artistry
Hmm.
itself, and it's great when you kind of get that meta commentary.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I mean, I think, obviously, the level of the artist gives you the level of the commentary.
True.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
I think, again, though, I can see why, a Psalm of Life can become cliche, can
Mm-hmm.
kind of become sort of where you're like, you're rolling your eyes at it, or where you could be like, I'm going to choose anything other than this poem just to show how much I know about poetry or like poetry. If you're
Mm-hmm.
like in the, 1920s,
Right.
and this poem's been rammed down your throat since you were in middle school.
Mm-hmm.
Because, we don't learn Longfellow like people used to, maybe 100 years ago.
No, no. I often would get them confused with, I think, Wordsworth.
Yeah, and to be honest with you, I actually thought that he might have been European before this. It didn't
Mm.
really it didn't really fully dawn on me that he was, and Wordsworth is European. He's from England.
Okay,
Um,
because we read, because in school we would read Wordsworth poetry like "Wander Lonely as a Cloud," and
mhm.
there was another one.
He's
I
got a
think it
few
was
of
like
them.
daffodils, something about the daffodils.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, he walks into a field of like 1,000 daffodils. It's like on a
Yeah,
sunny
yeah,
afternoon or something, or it's like a sunny stroll or afternoon stroll or something like
right.
that.
So
Yeah.
I often got Wadsworth Longfellow confused with Wordsworth.
Well, and I kind of would get him in there with him and like Alfred Lord Tennyson, you know,
Okay.
which is someone that he actually, he was a contemporary with and met, and
Mm.
on his final journey over to Europe. But and that's because I had this book that was like, it was a English poetry, and it had like Tennyson and Byron and like Shelley and Longfellow all like in the same section.
Mm.
So I kind of grouped him in there, and I think Wordsworth too, but like I kind of grouped him in there with those guys,
Oh,
and like
okay.
didn't quite realize like, oh, he's American. Like, and
Mm.
that's actually a a distinct characteristic about him until this, the last 2 weeks going into it with him.
Yeah, yeah, it is. It definitely is, and it's interesting that he was grouped with all those, but it's also interesting that he too, like all the Americans we've talked about, I think they've spent time overseas.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, I think, the language of America, which I know people would say there's no official language of, in America. But, with it being English, it having its roots in Europe, pretty much everyone here has their roots overseas. It kind of, all our culture, sort of, uh, kind of
there's a journey
originates somewhere
aspect.
else. Yeah,
Right.
yeah. Yeah, everything about us sort of originates somewhere else. It's only in more recent history that we've begun to then influence the rest of the world, where otherwise we have been the influenced.
Mm, right. And I feel like that marker is kind of where people kind of were like, we're American, kind of standing
Right,
kind
right.
of firm,
Hmm, hmm.
especially post World War II.
Right. And I think that's why World War II is so important for us, was that we're like, oh yeah, actually, we are the top dogs, you know?
Well, I
Yeah.
mean, we live in the mythology of World War II. I mean,
Right.
there's a
That's a
there's a
whole
re
nother discussion. We could have an
yeah,
episode of that. That's a
there
whole nother thing.
there really is.
Yeah.
But so
But
yeah,
hey, I mean, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, I
great
think
poet.
if you're probably watching this or listening to this, you are probably much like us, even if you don't want to admit it, in which you know of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, but you don't really know Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And that's okay. First step is just admitting that you don't really fully know him and just dive. And I would strongly recommend just diving into it. And the great thing is, all his great like Evangeline, Hiawatha, like all his epic poems, you can watch on YouTube, you can listen to on anywhere where you find podcasts, and like that's where this stuff is really meant. Just like Homer, like people didn't just sit down and read the Odyssey, they listened to it. They'd like get into like auditoriums and someone would, if not Homer himself, would recite, the poem. It was a performance. That's how this stuff started. So like I think listening to it is like where you really fully get it. And like you can read along to it. It's like Shakespeare. Sure, you can read Romeo and Juliet.
Hmm.
That's one thing. You can read Hamlet. That's one thing. Seeing it is like is something else, seeing it performed on stage. And so um that's my call to action.
I concur. It'll be worth it. This guy's good, and the thing is, there's going to be a lot. It's a lot of rhyme. It's a lot of
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of allusions to Greek mythology. You can kind of
Mm-hmm.
look up if you're into that sort of rabbit hole, and
Yep.
I mean, a lot of it does rhyme, so that
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of fun,
Yeah, right. Yeah, yeah. And it's okay.
and he gets real creative with the meter, and
Mm-hmm.
he
Mm-hmm.
changes it up. I mean, it's not. It's. I think a lot of his poetry is it's more diverse than a lot of contemporary poets. A lot of contemporary poets kind of stick to like I'm not gonna say stick to one style, but his it's very diverse.
Yeah,
It's not
yeah,
and it's not just straight sonnets.
yeah.
A lot of his collections are he has sonnet sections, but
Yes.
a lot
Yes.
it's not just straight sonnets. He mixes
Mm-hmm.
it up, he changes it up, changes up the rhyme scheme. So
Yeah.
I
I think
almost I
yeah.
almost thought that it might be good to get a book of his and then just mimic his rhyme and meter poem for poem just on my own.
I think that would be well worth the practice. I think that you would gain something from that. I think that's one advantage that he has, being more of an imitative poet, because he, like we talked about earlier, being a professor of modern languages, but he also, he knew like Scandinavian languages and, basically all the European languages he was essentially, fluent in. And so he could take from many different literary traditions and bring it into the English language and, sort of uh, just brought it into English. And so that's how he could kind of have such a diverse style, because he had a diverse influence. And
A lot
so,
of his poems are
yeah.
almost like exercises in a workbook.
Yes.
I got
Yes.
that notion several times while
Hmm, hmm.
reading through his works. And
Yeah.
that a lot of them are in the public domain, so
Hmm.
you can get them for free.
Yeah. Yeah. Don't give people too many ideas. Okay. So,
I mean,
yeah.
how much do we have to sing his praises?
Right.
Check
Right.
this
Yeah.
guy
Yeah.
out.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's free. It's in the
Yeah.
public. The notion of the public domain is that really speaks to our society.
Guys,
I
look,
mean,
this guy's been dead for over 70 years. Okay. So it's free game on any of his stuff. But it reminds me of,
pick his carcass clean.
yes, it reminds me of Bach. I had a music teacher in sixth grade, that told us that Bach was famous, and people either said, people loved him and said that you on one hand you could say, they loved him and hated him. On one hand, you could say he wrote 300, I think it was like sonatas or something, or like symphonies, or you could say he wrote the same symphony 300 times,
Mm,
and it was because, he had students, and so he wrote like small variations on, kind of the same thing over and over again, and
mm,
Wadsworth Longfellow is like a little bit different. He does have a wider range, but like you were saying with the workbook thing, you know, with some of these older artists, we're less forgiving of it, of people that are more contemporary, you know. When we hear Green Day do the same song for like, if you listen to their latest album and they're doing the same thing, now 40 years, you're like, ugh,
hey, a little drum and bass will go a long way.
Yeah, yeah,
I
but I
mean,
mean, you know, yeah, but I mean, you look back on the, when, you have like the whole life of a person, to see them kind of working through different styles, different, sort of mediums, and you can kind of witness the practice. One of my favorite things about Danny Brown, by the way, all his early mixtapes, and you can kind of hear him develop his sound, and you can kind of see, you have like the classics, the hits that come out, Psalm of Life, Children's Hour, Hiawatha, um, Evangeline, but then when you
Paul
get down to
Revere's
the,
ride.
yep, 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 and then when you get down to the nitty gritty and you see it's like kind of repetitive a little bit, maybe a little, you know, you can kind of see him working on some
You
things,
can say
and
like, okay, this is Wordsworth. I mean, yeah, this is
yeah,
a
yeah,
Longfellow. I can tell.
yeah. It just, I think it, for anybody who's currently writing, reading, doing this kind of thing, you know, if you can kind of feel like, for the last year, I've been writing basically the same three poems over and over again,
Mm,
you're not alone,
yeah,
you
and
know, feel free to evolve.
hey, nothing to it but to do it. And and the I read from Ultima Thule, which is kind of one of his last collections. So maybe that's why that collection is very dynamic and very
Mm, yes.
you know what I mean. It's almost like it kind of reminds me of like L.A. Woman by the Doors.
Mm, hmm,
How it was just so dynamic and like kind of like not to say that Morrison knew he was about to die, but I don't know. Who knows? Maybe there was
right,
something that
right.
he knew that maybe his time with the Doors was winding down. I don't know.
Maybe, yeah, it was like the end of an era.
But hey, man, I feel like that
But
was
hey,
solid.
yeah. Hey, Longfellow.
Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And get down in the comments, please. Anyone say
Right.
anything. We'll
Just say
respond.
anything. Just, yeah, I mean, either you agree with us or you don't, but just say it, okay?
Right? Yeah. It'll
Yeah.
help us out. Like, subscribe
Right.
if you're watching
Right.
this. And
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I've been
Right. Hey,
James.
I've been Justin, and this has been,
First take.
yeah. All right. Hey, and we'll be back in 2 weeks. We're changing up the format. We were going
Yeah.
weekly. We've taken a little bit of a break. Now we're gonna go bi-weekly, and hopefully we'll have some new things coming, and we'll keep evolving.
Because next time will be William Blake. And the reason we take two
Yes.
weeks is so that we could like maybe read like a whole book by some of these people.
Right. Yeah. Yep.
And
Get a little bit more in depth, and just, kind of, because we're learning along this journey as well.
right. And so William Blake, this is he'll be like, I guess he's one of the English romantics,
He's an English romantic. Yep.
kind of like Wordsworth, which you might as well throw Wordsworth on there, but
Eventually.
yeah, next week will be William Blake. Our next
Yep.
time, pardon me.
Next time. Yep.
All
All
right,
right.
man.
Well, hey,
See you guys
signing
later,
off.
man. All right, take care. All right, that one. I think that one was good because at the beginning, dude, we were like bouncing back and forth, hella good. I don't know if you could tell, but like we were like
Yeah, we're
going
getting
like
it down. I think we could get a little smoother on our